Welcome to Understanding Islam, the third series. We're on episode 8, when we're going to look at the ethical path of Islam. The heart of the Islamic way of life is based around belief in God and obeying the commands of God. So faith and deeds go hand in hand. They both need to be based upon the revelation of God and then put into practice. The role model for putting this into practice is, of course, Prophet Muhammad himself. The Quran speaks of him as a perfect example, the best of humankind amongst you, and therefore modeling one's life on the life of the Prophet is at the heart of the ethical system of Islam. Every human being, like the Prophet himself, is called to be a servant of God. This is the term abd. The Prophet was a servant of God. Human beings are to be servants of God. The servant is one who obeys, and therefore the heart of the ethical system is obedience. Obedience that will lead one through this life on the correct path, and that will lead one ultimately to the life hereafter in paradise, in proximity to God. So that is the goal of an ethical life: happiness in this life and in the life hereafter. Now, God has given us some great tools in order to be able to live this ethical way of life. First of all, there is the guidance itself in the text of the Quran and in the life of the Prophet. But then human beings have two great dignities, or two great tools given to them by God. The first is our intellect. We're able to think and to reason. And secondly, we have freedom of the will. So with intellect and freedom, we are able to govern the way that we live our lives. We are able to make ethical decisions and to will ourselves to put them into practice. So the human being is a free operative, responsible for their actions under God. This is part of the human dignity. This human dignity of intellect and freedom allows the human being to achieve the second of our great dignities, which is to be the khalifa of God, the regent or the agent of God upon earth. We are to live an ethical life and to build an ethical society. This is a great trust given to the human beings. It is a trust which we are told in the Quran, if it had been offered to the mountains, they would have rent asunder. So human beings, as the pinnacle of creation, have the ability to carry this trust, and by so doing, to actually live in the way that God ordained upon the earth. In this sense, through their obedience, to image upon the earth the kind of ways of God. Through these great tools and the guidance of the Quran, the human being is able to rise above our base nature, our base instincts. An animal operates by instincts, whereas the human being has the ability to reflect, to ponder upon the guidance, to come to a resolution, and then to put it into practice. So our will, our freedom, our intellect are the elements that drive the human being to rise above our lower instincts and desires. This should not be thought of as a burden, as though living an ethical life was going to be a killjoy. It was going to make life awful. In fact, quite the opposite. Because in Islamic understanding, God made human beings so that we should worship God, so that we should live in a way that pleases God, and therefore it should bring us fulfilment, it should bring us happiness. So this freedom to act leads us both to happiness in this life and the reward of happiness in the hereafter. We are fulfilled as human beings by living according to the divine guidance. Now, if living according to God's guidance brings us the fullness of human dignity, of joy and happiness in this life, then the opposite is also true. That is, to rebel against God's guidance, to enter into sin, in a sense, debases our human nature. It draws us down into something less than a fully human way of life. We become burdened by our sin. We become involved in a spiral of sin, which can lead us down further away from God, further into disobedience, and ultimately lead us to disbelief. So there is, in a sense, a spiritual battle which is going on within every human being all the time, between the ideals to which we are called to strive and base instincts, desires that we are called to resist. We're told that there is a natural forgetfulness in human beings, that to forget and to go and seek other paths, other lights, is something that is there within human nature. Therefore, it needs to be disciplined, it needs to be directed toward God. And so sometimes ethics are called the medicine of the spirit, because they are a series of spiritual practices lived out in reality that help us to grow in a godly way of life. The human conscience is very important in this regard because it accuses the human being when we do wrong and spurs us on to do something that we know to be right. So the human conscience is a very sensitive organ that actually draws us toward this godly path. But outer acts and inner dispositions go hand in hand in Islam. Our faith is to be realized in our deeds. Our deeds support and strengthen our faith. Sometimes I think of this as being rather like a coconut. Well, you can say that the precious bit of the coconut is the milk which is contained inside, is that lovely white flesh inside. But we know that that precious part would not hold together and would not exist without the tough outer shell and without the hairy matting which comes on the very outside. Now that coconut then can be a model for the human life between the inner spiritual goals and yearning and the outer religious acts of discipline that actually help and protect and preserve that inner spiritual force. And so outer observance gives protection, gives guidance, direction, sustenance to the inner spiritual reality of the human being. Ethics is sometimes called the philosophy or the science of morality. It is reflecting upon it, analyzing, coming to know and discern what is the moral path for the human being. Now, Islam prides itself on being the middle way. So generosity, for example, in Islamic virtue, is midway between meanness on the one side and extravagance on the other. So Islam is always the middle way between the two extremes. And the virtues of the middle way, of honesty and justice, uprightness, truthfulness, integrity, and so on, actually are the characteristics that the Islamic ethical system wants to build within the human being. Now, good characteristics build a good character, and therefore the goal is to build a good character within the nature of the person. And then good people will build a good society. So we have a progression from learning and implementing good character to coming to build a good society. Indeed, Rumi, the great poet of the Sufi tradition, says that human beings never really come to perfection in isolation. They only come to perfection when they live in community with others. We can take the example of patience. It's true that if I live alone in a cave, I am challenged to be patient with myself. But the real challenge of the ethic of patience is when I am in congress with other people, when I have to get along with other people in society. And so Rumi's point is to see that the individual is always living out a life which is in society alongside others. So we must not only build our ethical inner core, but we must build an ethical society as well. Human beings are required to live an ethical life within society. So we're told that the prophet was going through the marketplace and he saw a man selling figs. And the figs on the top, on the outside of the pile, were beautiful, succulent, moist, just what you would want to. You would be attracted to them. But then he noticed that if you dug down into the pile, there were rotten, wet figs down there. So he asked the seller, "What's this? What sort of display is this?" And the man explained, "Well, those figs underneath, they got wet, and so they've started to go rotten." So the prophet said, "You must display them. You must put them out on top where everybody can see, because you are required to live by an ethical code of conduct that affects your business as well. Make your display known so that people know what they're buying." Now, this story leads us into the institution, for example, of market supervisors within Islamic societies, whose responsibility it was to make sure that all the business conducted in the market was according to Islamic business ethics. This is the forerunner of what we would today call a trading standards organization. One of the things about the guidance given by God is that God is merciful. God does not burden us with things that are impossible or with things that would stretch us beyond reasonable limits. And so I want to share with you two hadith from the Prophet in which he makes it clear that we should not indulge in what are called scruples, constantly asking again and again, should I do this, should I do this, seeking for certainty. Instead, we should get on with life. So, in the first hadith, the Prophet said, "O people, God has prescribed for you the pilgrimage, therefore perform it." One man stood up and asked, "Are we to do it every year?" First, the Prophet abstained from replying. And then the questioner persisted. And so the prophet answered him with a slightly reproachful tone, as follows. If I were to say yes, this would mean that it was prescribed. If you were obliged to perform it every year, you would hardly be able to comply with that. Leave me in peace, as I leave you. It is because of their questioning and debating around their prophets that your predecessors perished. So when I forbid you something, avoid it. If I command you something, you only have to put it into practice as much as you are able. And then again, the prophet is reported to have said, God established limits within which you must not exceed, prescribed duties which you must not neglect, and has instituted precautions which you must never violate. But he has also omitted things, not out of forgetfulness, but out of compassion for you. In such cases, do not inquire too much. So we see an important principle of obeying the commands and observing the prohibitions, but not constantly pushing and pushing for certainty. There is a certain responsibility within the human being to live according to God's direction and get on with it. Islamic ethical practice codifies human acts into different categories. There are those acts which are obligatory, there are those which are prohibited, but in fact these are fairly small in number. Then there are those acts which are recommended and those acts which are disliked, and they also are fairly small in number. The vast majority of human acts are in the middle category of neutral. That is, the human being, under God's guidance, gets on with life in that sphere which is the neutral sphere in the middle. So God never commands that which is going to bring about hardship for the individual. Rather, God wants our ease and not our hardship. This becomes a principle in Islamic law that if there is a question and a scholar is asked to investigate and look into it, what is the teaching of Islam on this question? Well, it could be this answer or it could be that answer. The scholar is then required to take the easier option, because God wants our ease and not our hardship. In the same way, God never commands that which is impossible. So, for example, when Muslims are at prayer, there are certain bodily movements that are required: standing, bowing, kneeling, prostrating. But somebody who is handicapped physically in some way, so that they cannot make those movements, makes them to the limits of their ability. So God does not command the impossible. Human beings can adapt with flexibility according to the commandments of God as necessary, remembering always that the individual is accountable before God. An important ethical principle is that obligations are to be fulfilled according to our ability to do them. We see again that God always understands the circumstances in which human beings live. So money is to be given, to be made to circulate within society, with khums and with zakat, provided that one has achieved a certain basic income and surplus. If one is too poor to be able to keep one's family, then obviously one is not obliged to take money that should be given to the children to eat and to apply that as zakat instead. So always there is this counsel of what is possible in the circumstances. God does not demand the impossible. We have another important ethical principle, that God wants our good and not our harm. God does not want us to harm ourselves in some major significant way through performing a good act. So, for example, during the month of Ramadan, all adult Muslim men and women are commanded to fast. But not if you're sick, not if you're a woman who is pregnant, not if you are traveling in a circumstance in which to fast would cause undue harm to your being. So God wills our good and not our harm. And that policy then, that principle, is applied in various ethical situations throughout life. Another important ethical principle is what we call a hierarchy of values. Some things are more important than others. The highest ethical value is to preserve life. Now, we can see that in the case of someone who is unable to get water for washing for prayers. I have just enough water so that I can either drink it or I can use it for washing for prayer. Which should I do? Well, you should drink the water because you should preserve your life. And you can use dust or sand to perform dry ablutions for prayers. We can take that even one step further. Everyone knows that Muslims are forbidden to drink alcohol and to eat pork. But what happens if you are washed up on a desert island as a Muslim, and the only thing that you have washed up with you is a cask of beer and a cask of salted pork? There's nothing else to eat or drink on the island. Now, if you abstain from these two, then you will die. Preserving your life is more important than observing the dietary laws and abstaining from the alcohol and the pork. Of course, as soon as other forms of food and drink become available, they become forbidden, haram, once again. So this is contained in the ethical principle, necessity knows no laws. When necessity drives, then lesser laws may be broken in order to provide for the ultimate necessity, for example, preserving human life. Finally, let us say that God is purposeful. God is, of course, a totally free being. Nobody can control God. But what we know from God's revelation is that God is serious in regard to human beings and the rest of creation. This means that our intellects can work with what God has revealed and with what God has guided humankind to over centuries, and use this as a reliable guide for what God would want in a new circumstance. So God is purposeful and serious. God doesn't vacillate and keep changing his mind. Now, all this requires then that there will be a lot of intellectual effort in working out how to live an ethical life in various different circumstances in which human beings encounter around the world today. This is necessarily going to lead to diversity. There will be diversity within the Muslim community, and there always has been diversity within the community, except for a few basic things. This diversity is a blessing, and it is a sign to human beings of God's mercy and of the importance that God has given to the human being through the gift of intellect and of free will, so that we can work out for ourselves within that guidance how to live an ethical way of life. Join me next week when we're going to be exploring the code of living in Islam, the Sharia. I look forward to seeing you then.